You know, it's funny. Anytime you see the words Bitcoin and climate change together, you kind of brace yourself for like
Mm.
an argument, you know?
Yeah.
But this article you sent about this climate expert video, it's different. Like, it almost feels like they're flipping the script on how we usually talk about this stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
So before we really dive in, and we've got a lot to unpack here, can you remind me again, like, what's the main argument this video is making?
Basically, it's challenging the common narratives we hear about Bitcoin's environmental impact. It argues that a lot of the criticism, especially around energy consumption, is overblown. And they go even further, questioning the whole doom and gloom narrative around CO2.
Okay, see, that's what I thought I remember, but it's almost so different from what you usually hear that I wanted to double check. So let's start with the Bitcoin part. The article mentioned critics focusing on Bitcoin mining, making it sound like this, like, energy-sucking monster. But this video seems to claim that it's not as simple as that.
Right, exactly. The video acknowledges that mining Bitcoin does require a lot of energy. That's not something they're disputing.
Okay, so where's the disconnect then?
Well, they argue that the way we usually talk about it lacks context. Like, we focus on how much energy Bitcoin uses, but ignore how much energy other industries, even essential ones, consume.
Hmm, that's a fair point. I mean, I've never really thought about how much energy it takes to, like, run the entire global banking system.
Right. Or think about something as simple as data storage, all those servers for the cloud.
Really?
That uses a massive amount of energy, but we don't talk about it in the same way. The video also stresses the increasing shift towards renewable energy sources in Bitcoin mining. There are these huge mining operations in places like Iceland and Norway that are powered entirely by geothermal and hydroelectric energy.
Okay, see, that's interesting. So it's not just about how much energy is being used, but also where that energy is coming from, right?
Exactly.
But, okay, the part that really threw me for a loop was the video's take on CO2. They almost seem to be defending carbon dioxide, saying it's crucial for life. That's not something you hear every day.
It's definitely a different perspective than what we're used to. But what the video does is it reframes how we think about CO2. It reminds us that it's the basis for photosynthesis. Without it, plants wouldn't exist. And no plants means no oxygen for us.
Wow. It's funny how we can go through life just taking something as basic as oxygen for granted.
Right. The video even goes so far as to say fighting against CO2 is like fighting against oxygen or water. They're all elements that are essential for life to exist.
Okay, so they're saying we've got it all wrong by making CO2 out to be this, like, evil thing.
Seems that way, yeah. The video emphasizes that CO2 actually makes up a tiny percentage of Earth's atmosphere, like it's around 0.04%.
That's it.
They use this example. Imagine 10,000 molecules of air. Out of those, only one extra CO2 molecule is due to human activity.
Wow, that puts things in perspective. You know, it's amazing how quickly we can get caught up in a narrative without really, like, looking at the whole picture.
That's exactly their point.
So if warmer periods aren't always a bad thing, and CO2 isn't this ultimate evil, what's driving this whole idea that we're in a climate crisis?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Because the video seems to suggest there might be other agendas at play here, maybe even political or economic ones.
Okay, now that's what I mean by controversial. Like, what kind of agendas are we even talking about here?
Well, the video talks about how some governments and institutions might be using this fear of a climate crisis to increase their own power and control.
Like, how so?
Think about it. If people are convinced that climate change is an existential threat, they might be more willing to accept things like restrictions on their freedom, all in the name of saving the planet.
Okay, yeah, I see where you're going with this. So it's like using the climate crisis as an excuse to control what people do.
That's one way to look at it. And it's not just about individual freedoms either. They also talk about how this ties into monetary policy.
Monetary policy. Okay, now you're just using big words to make me feel dumb. But seriously, explain it like I'm 5.
Basically, when governments print too much money, it devalues the currency, which leads to inflation. Right.
Right, got it. Inflation, bad.
Exactly. And the video argues that this creates a situation where governments need to find new ways to maintain control because their usual methods aren't working as well. And one of those ways could be through climate policies.
Interesting. So it's like they're using climate change as a way to gain more control over the economy.
Potentially. It's a pretty bold claim.
It is.
Yeah.
And, you know, it makes you think about Bitcoin in a whole new light, too. Like, we've been conditioned to think of it as this maybe risky or volatile thing. But if this video is to be believed, Maybe some of the powers that be see it as a threat to their control over the financial system.
Yeah, that's definitely something to think about.
Okay, so we've covered a lot, but I still feel like we're just scratching the surface. Like, where do we even go from here?
Well, I think the first step is acknowledging that there are multiple perspectives on these issues. The video does a good job of presenting a counter-narrative to what we usually hear.
It does. Oh,
And whether you agree with everything in the video or not, it forces you to think critically and question assumptions. And that, I think, is always a good thing.
I'm with you on that. So for our listeners who might be feeling a little overwhelmed right now, what's the key takeaway?
I would say approach all information with a healthy dose of skepticism. Don't just accept something as true because it's presented as fact or because it aligns with your existing beliefs.
Even if it comes from a climate expert.
Especially then. Do your own research, look for evidence, and be open to changing your mind when presented with new information.
I love that. And, that's what we try to do here on these deep dives.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining me in this, intellectual wrestling match. It's been enlightening, to say the least.
The pleasure's all mine.
And to our listeners, keep those brains buzzing, because we've got a lot more to unpack in our next
I
episode.
really can't wait.
So if warmer periods aren't always a bad thing, and CO2 isn't this ultimate evil, what's driving this whole idea that we're in a climate crisis? The article hinted that the video gets into some controversial territory here, suggesting there might be other motivations at play.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely a bit of a rabbit hole.
A rabbit hole is a good way to put it. What do you think they're getting at with these other motivations?
Well, they seem to be suggesting that framing climate change as an existential threat could be a way for some governments and institutions to increase their control.
Okay, now that's a bold claim. What kind of control are we talking about?
Well, they argue that if people are convinced that climate change is going to destroy the planet, they might be more willing to accept things like restrictions on their freedoms.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. It's like they're using climate change as an excuse to control what people do.
Right. Like, think about it. Limitations on travel, restrictions on certain types of consumption, regulations on what people eat, all in the name of reducing emissions.
So it's like using the climate crisis as a way to justify a more controlled economy where individual choice is limited.
That's one interpretation the video puts forward.
Yeah.
And they tie this back to monetary policy as well. It's like a whole other layer to this.
Okay, now you're just using big words to make me feel dumb. Monetary policy. Come on, break it down for me.
Basically, it's all about how governments control the supply of money. And their argument is that when governments print too much money, it leads to inflation.
Right, got it. Inflation, bad.
Exactly. And they're saying this creates a situation where governments need to find new ways to maintain control because their usual methods aren't working as well.
Because of the inflation.
Exactly. And one of those ways could be through climate policies.
Interesting. So it's like they're using climate change as a way to gain more control over the economy.
That's the gist of it, yeah. It's a pretty bold claim, to be sure.
It is. And, it makes you think about Bitcoin in a whole new light, too. We've been conditioned to think of it as this maybe risky or volatile thing. But if this video is to be believed, maybe some of the powers that be see it as a threat to their control over the financial system.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about. It challenges the whole narrative, right?
Big time. Okay, so we've covered a lot, but I still feel like we're just scratching the surface. Where do we even go from here?
Well, I think the first step is acknowledging that there are multiple perspectives on these issues. And, the video does a good job of presenting a counter-narrative to what we usually hear.
Yeah, it definitely makes you think twice.
And whether you agree with everything in the video or not, it forces you to think critically and question assumptions. And that, I think, is always a good thing.
Couldn't agree more. So, for our listeners who might be feeling a little overwhelmed right now, what's the key takeaway from all of this?
I'd say approach all information, especially about something as complex as climate change, with a healthy dose of skepticism. Don't just accept something as true, even if it comes from
Even if it comes from a climate expert.
Exactly. Do your own research, look for evidence, and be open to changing your mind when presented with new information.
I love that. And, that's what we try to do here on these deep dives, challenge those assumptions.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining me in this, intellectual wrestling match. It's been enlightening, to say the least.
The pleasure's all mine. I always enjoy a good deep dive into these topics.
And to our listeners, keep those brains buzzing, because we've got a lot more to unpack in our next episode, where we'll try to bring all these threads together and make sense of it all.
Looking forward to it.
It's a lot to process, for sure.
Yeah.
It's so easy to just go along with whatever everyone else is saying,
Yeah.
But after a deep dive like this, it really makes you realize how important it is to, like, actually think for yourself, question things, look at things from different angles.
Absolutely. It's so crucial to remember that there's always more to the story than meets the eye. And often those different perspectives, the ones we don't usually hear, they can be incredibly revealing.
For sure. This video definitely throws a wrench in how we usually think about Bitcoin, CO2, and climate change. And even if someone might not agree with every single point they made, I think it forces you to, at the very least, confront your own biases and engage with these topics in a more, critical way.
Exactly. And that's what's so valuable about engaging with viewpoints that challenge our assumptions. It's not about blindly accepting or rejecting information, but using it as a springboard for critical thinking
Mm.
and deeper understanding.
Totally. It's like it reminds you that the world isn't black and white. There are so many shades of gray. And a lot of times the truth is somewhere in those nuances. So where does this all leave us? What's the takeaway for our listeners who might be feeling a little mind blown right now?
If this deep dive has sparked anything in you, if it's made you question the information you've been given or the way you've been thinking about these topics, that's a win in my book. The most important thing is to stay curious, stay engaged, and keep asking questions.
Love that. Don't just take our word for it, or even the video's word for it. Go out there and dig deeper, explore different perspectives, and come to your own conclusions. That's what we should all be striving for.
Absolutely.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, on that note, a huge thank you to you for joining me today. This has been an incredibly thought-provoking conversation.
It's been my pleasure. Always a pleasure to dive into these topics with you.
And to our amazing listeners, keep those brains buzzing, and we'll catch you in the next episode, where we'll tackle another fascinating topic. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and as always, thanks for listening.
See you next time.